Fascism as an ideology did not develop in Germany, but as we've seen, in Italy, as a movement of national discipline and regeneration. It's easy to see how such a set of ideas would be attractive in the Germany of the Weimar Republic, where there was the brooding anger of an entire nation, bitter in defeat and looking both for a new model of national reconstruction and a leader who would redress the wrongs of Versailles and restore German power and pride. The Nazi, that is the National Socialist German Workers' Party, was identified as the hope of the German nation and Hitler as its savior. The Nazis were initially just another one of those fringe groups that proliferated under the Weimar Republic. It owed its rising prominence to Adolf Hitler and his ruthlessness and his skill at oratory. Hitler wasn't even born in Germany, but in Austria in 1889, into a middle-class family. He wanted to be an artist or an architect, but was twice refused admission to the art school in Vienna, adding to his sense of marginalization. Using his orphan's pension and some inheritance for support, he didn't work, but spent his time listening to Wagner operas and reading anti-Semitic tracts, particularly the radical nationalist pamphlets produced by the pan-German movement of Georg von Schönener. This pan-German perspective, which was essentially a racist group of ideologues, identified Jews in Darwinian terms as people with weak racial characteristics. He equally developed a hatred of Marxism and socialism, and for similar social Darwinian reasons. He believed that these leftist parties promised support of the weak and the infirm, and consequently they would contribute to the degeneration of the race. And also, socialists lacked the moral courage to assist in the creation of the Superman or a superior race, and this was evident in the fact that they had signed the Treaty of Versailles. It was World War I that really gave Hitler his purpose. He was brave, he won the Iron Cross, and for the first time, this dislocated loner found a sense of camaraderie in the trenches. He was a member of a community almost for the first time in his life. He was consequently shattered by Germany's defeat, believing, like so many others, that the brave, superior German army was not defeated, but betrayed by Jews, socialists, pacifists, and other non-German elements. This belief that Germany had been stabbed in the back we've seen before, and it wasn't limited to marginal men like Adolf Hitler, but was broadly accepted by many Germans, including professional soldiers, who simply couldn't believe that Germany had lost the war. This general belief, this acceptance of the idea that Germany in fact had been betrayed by socialists and weaklings within, helped Hitler rise to power profoundly, because Hitler seemed to be saying what large numbers of Germans, ordinary Germans, believed to be true. The chaos and the anarchy in Germany in 1918-1919 reinforced Hitler's hatred of the left and the socialists who signed the Versailles Treaty. He saw Friedrich Ebert and his party simply as traitors, and he shared the opinion of the far right that capitulation to the Treaty of Versailles reflected the moral weakness and the treachery of the socialists. He joined the Nazi Party in 1919 and rose rapidly. In 1923, he was its leader. And he attracted to it many violent, angry ex-soldiers, social misfits and thugs. In an attempt to foment a general right-wing coup, as we saw, Hitler led his group in 1923 to overthrow the Bavarian state in his Munich beer hall putsch. It failed and he was arrested, but he used his trial as publicity. He used his trial to denounce the Versailles Treaty, to denounce Jews, Marxists in the Weimar Republic. As we saw, Hitler was sent to prison for a very short period of time, and this too he turned to his advantage. He used the enforced leisure to write Mein Kampf, in which he promised that the superior German race, disciplined and given an iron will by a great leader, would destroy decadent liberalism and socialism. But these goals would not be achieved through revolution. Rather, Hitler determined that the route to power would be through manipulation of the Weimar state until he could destroy it. He had such contempt for the socialists and contempt for the Republic that he believed that its very weakness could be used by the Nazis in order to create something quite different, and that the Weimar Republic would be incapable of stopping them simply because of its inherent weakness. Well, the Nazis then did in fact do exactly that. They came to power legitimately through the ballot box. By 1927, the party had about 75,000 members, and in the 1928 elections won 12 seats. But the world financial crash of 1929 and the failure of mainstream parties to solve the problems and the growing despair among the German people made the German populace generally susceptible to Hitler's terrible message. In the 1930 election, the Nazis won 107 seats in the Reichstag and captured 6,500,000 votes. This made the Nazis one of the largest political groups in Germany and Hitler one of the most powerful politicians. Also, the profusion of parties and the paralysis of the left catapulted Hitler into power, the result of that proportional representation system that we saw established in the Weimar Constitution, a system that made it very difficult for any one party to win a majority and gave enormous influence to small parties within coalitions. And by the election of 1932, this was evident. No party could build a coalition in the Reichstag to assure a majority because the Nazis, who had captured the largest number of seats, 230 or 37% of the popular vote, refused to support any coalition that was not led by Adolf Hitler. That year, 1932, the Nazis, using propaganda, street marches, and intimidation, established their reputation as active and energetic, with the discipline perhaps to solve Germany's problems. While on the left, the communists were committing a kind of suicide of the left by refusing to share power with the socialists to build a leftist coalition. This kept the government paralyzed. The communists had never forgiven the socialists for suppressing the Spartacist revolts, and they now refused to cooperate with them in the Reichstag. The result was, by January 1933, the situation was truly desperate. There had to be some mechanism for forming a working government. It was urgently required. A powerful lobby, a lobby of extreme conservatives, industrialists, bankers, landed aristocrats, and some old army officers, convinced the increasingly senile old president, Paul von Hindenburg, to name Hitler as chancellor. It was a cynical maneuver to capitalize on Hitler's popularity and bring the right wing to power. The scheme, though, was to control Hitler. The scheme was for a conservative Roman Catholic aristocrat, Franz von Papen, to be named as vice-chancellor. The intention was that von Papen would control Hitler and his party. Of course, they were wrong about being able to restrain Hitler and underestimated the degree of popular support that the Nazi Party actually enjoyed. Hitler was himself very, very skilled at taking advantage of opportunities, as we've seen. And in February 1933, a perfect opportunity arose. A Dutch communist set fire to the Reichstag. This was not a political act. The Dutch communist was mentally unstable. It was an act of arson committed by a madman. But Hitler was able to convince President Hindenburg that this was a direct threat to the integrity of the state. He manipulated the senile old man into suspending the Constitution and issuing a decree of emergency. Hitler ruthlessly then used this situation to imprison socialist and communist politicians, and the Nazi stormtroopers took to the streets, attacking their opponents, spreading terror. These tactics ensured that there would be a Nazi victory, with the party winning as much as 80% of the popular vote in some areas in March of 1933. With this solid popular support, 288 seats in the Reichstag in the 1933 elections, and with the opposition either imprisoned or silenced by fear, there was no doubt but that the Nazis were the strongest power in Germany. This gave Hitler, now Chancellor, almost dictatorial authority to use the emergency powers placed in his hands by Hindenburg. The Nazis could now move their real agenda, the establishment of a dictatorship under Adolf Hitler. Almost immediately, the Nazis set to work dismantling the despised Weimar Republic. The Reichstag, firmly under Nazi control, passed the Enabling Act on the 23rd of March 1933. This act enabled Hitler, as Chancellor, and his cabinet to enact laws without the participation of the Reichstag at all. Now in complete control, Hitler declared the Weimar Republican experiment over. He replaced the German flag with the Nazi symbol, the swastika. He centralized government. He abolished the federal system that had been established by Bismarck and maintained by the Weimar regime. And he outlawed all regional bodies, replacing the provincial officials with Nazi governors. This totalitarian state abolished all political parties except the Nazis, silenced all opponents. There was total censorship of the press, and the Nazi Party took control of education. The economy and industry were made subject to the party. In fact, Hitler controlled every aspect of German life in a highly centralized and very efficient manner. A major difference between Mussolini in Italy and the Nazis under Hitler in Germany was that Italian fascism had no real essence of racial theory. Initially, the Italian fascists didn't indulge in racial theory except for the almost universal European belief in the superiority of the white race over others in the context of building empires and seizing territory, especially in Africa. So the Italian fascists began to develop their racial theories only under pressure from the Nazis after the Pact of Steel at the end of the 1930s was put in place. The Nazis, however, from the beginning particularly of Hitler's involvement with the party, believed and instilled in its members the most pernicious forms of racial prejudice. Much of this came from Hitler's early reading of those pseudo-scientists who developed theories of racial hierarchy. In this perverse hierarchy of races, Jews, blacks, Slavs, Gypsies, and other marginalized groups inhabited the lower regions. At the top were the so-called Aryan peoples. A fiction, a fantasy created out of pseudoscience and pseudo-anthropology to make the Germanic peoples superior to all others. Of course, there were no Aryans. It was a non-existent, imaginary group identified by racial supremacists, but given a reality by Nazi scientists who began to find even archaeological memories of this non-existent group, something that the SS and Heinrich Himmler particularly enjoyed doing. Even amongst the Aryans, though, there were gradations. At the top were the almost Nietzschean supermen, individuals who are capable of committing unspeakable crimes in order to benefit the race, to cleanse the race, and to assist in natural selection in an active way. This act of will would be required to ensure that those people who could weaken the race would be eliminated, and eliminated in time. And it wasn't just on the basis of race that this theory began to develop. It was broader than race. You were to be selected out on the basis of infirmity, sexual orientation, or even, as the Nazis had practiced from the beginning of their regime, political allegiance. Once in power, the Nazis moved immediately against those they identified for first marginalization and then ultimately extinction. For example, Jews were initially fired from government positions. They were forbidden to teach in schools or universities. Interracial marriages were outlawed. Jews could not employ non-Jews. And the great many more daily humiliations were legislated against the fellow Germans who simply happened to be Jews. Soon after, Jews were deprived of their German citizenship altogether, and their civil rights were removed through the so-called Nuremberg Laws, promulgated in 1935. This anti-Semitic program drove a great many Jews to leave Germany, those who had the wherewithal and the courage to simply realize that they had to leave in order to save their lives and the lives of their families. Those who couldn't afford it, or those who thought that this was only a passing fantasy of a madman, remained, and they unfortunately were few to survive. And even before the final act of Holocaust, those who remained were subjected to constant acts of violence by Nazi thugs, constant humiliation. Then, to symbolize their aggressively anti-Semitic policies against German Jews, those very Nazi thugs made things very clear to not only Germany but to the world. In a coordinated night of terror across the entire country, the night of November 9th, 10th, 1938, Jewish shops were smashed, synagogues were burned, and Jews were viciously beaten and humiliated in the street, given toothbrushes and forced to wash the sidewalks in front of Aryan houses. This was the infamous Kristallnacht, crystal glass knocked night, the night of broken glass. Anti-Semitism and Nazi racial theory were taught as science. They formed part of the school curriculum. And if that weren't enough, outside of school in the extracurricular disciplined organizations that we've seen developing in the 19th century, All young people between the ages of 10 and 18, boys and girls, were required to join the Hitler Youth. And this, of course, was for further indoctrination and paramilitary discipline and training. Every professional organization, every club, every association was taken over by the Nazi Party. Trade unions were abolished or, in fear, simply voted themselves out of existence. Almost every job in the civil service, the military, the school system, or any public body whatsoever required membership in the Nazi Party. Hitler's control of Germany was complete, and tragically, it was a control that benefited from the active cooperation of most of the German people. What the Nazis were instituting was a regime that combined the most despicable of the ideologies of the 19th century with a perversion of ideas that had been intended to improve and not to diminish the human condition. Obviously, the extreme nationalism speaks for itself. Racial theory, associated with social Darwinism, was taught as science, perverting the liberal belief in justice, equality, freedom, and the law. Racial cleansing developed from the hygiene movement and from eugenics, and social engineering became outright Nazi policy in order to create that super race of Aryans. Equally, there were strong connections to those who rejected rationalism. They were looking for an almost mystical leader to lead the people to a promised land. Nietzsche's cult of the Superman is clearly evident, but so was Kafka's absurd but menacing world, a world that moved from fiction into reality, because life under the Nazis was in fact a Kafkaesque experience in almost every way. It's tragic that so many of the ideas then of industrialized and scientific Europe found their perverted application in the most pernicious regime that the continent had ever produced. Nazism, then, was not the product of madmen. Tragically, it was the product of Europe. How was this sustained? How were otherwise rational, educated, cultivated Germans convinced that Hitler was, as he and the Nazis continually shouted, Germany itself? The answer lay in the cult of personality and the cult of the leader. Hitler was portrayed by the sophisticated Nazi propaganda machine as the ultimate fascist leader, one who could never err, who personified all Germans, one people, one state, one leader. Nazism became a kind of religion, with Hitler, who was identified as a personification of Germany, replacing God. Mein Kampf, which evangelized the Nazi belief in blood and soil, became a sacred text. We can see memories of this even in Rousseau's Social Contract and the idea of the lawgiver or the representation of the general will. We can certainly see it in Mussolini's development of the cult of the leader in the Italian Fascist Party, where Mussolini ha sempre ragione, Mussolini is always right. Always just agree with Mussolini because he never errs, because he is Italy. The Nazis took these ideas and took them to their logical or illogical extreme. Nazism and the texts in the cult of Nazism became a daily aspect of German life. It was so completely intertwined with the existence of being German in the 1930s and 1940s that it couldn't really be separated out. A simple example is that on a wedding day, the gift to be given to the bride and groom was a copy of Mein Kampf. I'm not saying it was read, but the symbolism is clear. A rekindled sense of national pride, illustrated in spectacles like party rallies in Nuremberg, torchlight parades, propaganda films, and even the Berlin Olympics, cemented the vast majority of Germans to this unspeakable regime. Today, all we have to do is see the films of Leni Riefenstahl, Triumph of the Will of the 1934 party rally in Nuremberg, or Olympia of the 1938 Olympics in Berlin, to see, in fact, how this works. The opening of Triumph of the Will, where Hitler, surrounded by Wagnerian music, descends in an aircraft from the sky like a god exiting Valhalla in order to bring organization, wisdom, and will to his people. The films of Leni Riefenstahl and the other great filmmakers who were brought by the Nazi propaganda machine into the party really did have an hypnotic effect. The use of spectacle. Albert Speer's taking the searchlights at Nuremberg and not shining them on the crowd or even on the stage, but directly up. So it looked as though the Nuremberg space was in fact surrounded by great columns that stretched to heaven. These were moments of cinematic brilliance. They were also elements of organized terror, because you felt larger than something, you felt to be part of something larger than yourself. But at the same time, you also realized that you had to subject yourself to the greater whole. You had to stop your own reason from functioning. In other words, you had to submit your will. And the triumph of the will is not an individual, really, it's a collective will, at least as defined by Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Not all the means of control were as benign as spectacle and extravagant events. Hitler's hypnotic hold over the German people was also reinforced by state terror. And this was designed to create terror everywhere, to silence opponents, whether the political left, the dissident intellectual classes, those few churchmen who didn't submit to the Nazis, or those who simply questioned whether in fact this was the right road for Germany to take. The manifestation of this terror was, of course, the infamous concentration camps. The camps were first established in the 1930s to eliminate political prisoners, particularly communists, Christians, socialists, and others. And also, they increasingly began to absorb criminals, or those labeled by Nazis as just of inferior stock. Not only Jews, but also gypsies, Slavs, and homosexuals, or the mentally ill, or even the physically disabled. They were put together for a kind of control to separate them out from the Aryan race, so they would not, in this world developed from 19th century concepts of the hygienic movement, so they would not infect the pure German race. These camps would, of course, during the war, become the sites of the Holocaust, where more than 6 million Jews, and it's been estimated up to 10 million more victims, were slaughtered. This, too, is really an extension of 19th century industrial society. What Hitler and the killing machine that he created did, in fact, was apply the industrial method, the factory system, to mass murder. In order to murder that many people, you in fact had to do it on an industrial level, on a level of mass production. Instead of producing goods, they were producing murder. Hitler in 1934 even purged his own party, murdering the head of the stormtroopers and effectively neutralizing the SA, that group of thugs, the stormtroopers that had made the streets of German cities so dangerous. Why did he do this? Well, he no longer needed thugs. This permitted the others who were perhaps just as thuggish, but perhaps not in quite a direct manner, like Heinrich Himmler, who became head of the German National Police, the SS, to come to prominence. The SS would be responsible for running the concentration camps, for carrying out the special actions against Jews and communists in Poland and Russia and elsewhere after the war had begun. And this special group was also to be identified very closely with those men of moral courage, those supermen who would be called upon to commit unspeakable acts, acts of mass murder, the murder of children in front of their parents, the murder of perfectly innocent young men and women in gas chambers. How could they do it? They believed that they were in fact part of this virtuous Nietzschean Superman elite, and they had to do it because they had to prove that they in fact were members of that elite, called upon to do unspeakable things, but for the well-being of the race, of the Aryan people, and of course the ambitions of Adolf Hitler that represented all of these things. In foreign affairs, Hitler was now in a position to begin the repudiation of the hated Treaty of Versailles. Nazi policy had always been to reincorporate into Germany those lost Germans who lived in Austria, Czechoslovakia, Alsace-and-Lorraine, and Poland. Hitler began by rebuilding the Army, Navy, and Air Force in direct contravention of the Versailles Treaty. And in 1936, he reoccupied the Rhineland as a way to test the reaction of France and Britain to Germany's ambitions. Remember, the Rhineland was to remain occupied until a referendum would then determine whether, in fact, this would return to Germany. And how did those democracies who had fought the Great War to make the world safe for democracy respond? They did nothing. Neither France nor Britain was interested in another war. They had sacrificed too much, and also their economic situation was desperate, and they themselves were divided along class and ideological lines. So no effort was made to stop German troops from moving into the region, even though at that moment France was much more militarily powerful than Germany and could easily have imposed the Versailles terms once more on the Nazi state, had it chosen to do so. Simultaneously, Hitler used his dictatorial powers to address the economic problems of Germany. Following the example of Mussolini in Italy, Hitler undertook a massive program of public works, including the creation of a transportation system of highways, the Autobahn, which are still there, and airports and other facilities that could be used not just for moving people and goods, that also could be used for moving troops. The Nazis were also populists. They offered what they believed as universal benefits. The Nazis, of course, were Germany, and so they realized the needs of Germans at every level. And so they realized that the gracious paternal gifts of the leader should flow in all directions. So not just elements of social legislation, but things like the development of the Volkswagen car. The Volkswagen, the people's car, was developed under Hitler so that members of the working and even lower middle class could in fact have automobiles, something that previously had been the privilege of the upper middle class and the elite. The idea of a people's car, something that was a clear indication of the benefits that the Nazis provided for common people, was symbolic as much as it was a means of transportation. Hitler and his gang thought very, very clearly about what it is they were going to do and how to do it. It was an extremely efficient and well-considered regime, but one, of course, that was based upon the principles of not only mass terror, but on a set of ideologies that were so terrible that the results would be the worst regime in the history of the continent, and perhaps even the world. But they went beyond that. Rebuilding the military and the making of armaments absorbed the unemployed. Unemployment plummeted. Property stolen from Jews and others enriched the state and rewarded the leaders of the regime. Hermann Goering, the Reichsmarshal, had a collection of art that perhaps was one of the greatest collections of art ever amassed. Of course, it was all stolen, but nevertheless, he did put it together, and he did have the opportunity to enjoy it. This then leads to that cosmic question that I receive every year from my students. How can a modern, industrial, scientific, highly cultivated nation like Germany, the nation of Bach and Beethoven and Goethe, accept these ideas? How could the people who made this system work, who ran the trains that carried the political prisoners and the Jews and others to their deaths, how could they cooperate? Well, there's no easy answer. Terror had a great deal to do with it. Fear. I asked them what they would do if their Jewish neighbor just disappeared one night. Would they complain? Would they draw it to someone's attention? Or would they be silent, fearful for their own lives and the lives of their family? We have to understand the degree of humiliation with the Versailles Treaty. We have to understand the economic circumstances that we've discussed that had bankrupted an entire nation and destroyed all of the hopes of not only the middle classes, but anybody with any money and savings or any hopes for the future. Also, there was that element that we cannot miss, and that's part of the German character to some extent that was most visible in the old Imperial Reich, and that is a respect for authority, a respect for military power, a respect for the army, and looking for an element of paternalism. The old German Reich, established by Bismarck in 1871, was in fact one that was very carefully structured in order to give a paternalistic sense of belonging. Well, Hitler continued that. And he continued it in a way that everybody felt they could feel some of the elements of the benefits that came from Hitler being in charge of Germany. But nevertheless, all we can say is that there were those who tried to stop him. Hitler wished his Reich to not only unite all of the Germans and the German-speaking peoples into a single state, but also he realized that he had to do this in a way that would at least initially not provoke the Allies. The Anschluss, or the peaceful union between Germany and Austria, occurred in 1938, again despite the Versailles Treaty, which had forbidden it specifically. In September of 1938, Hitler met with the leaders of Britain and France in Munich to discuss Germany's territorial ambitions in Europe. And the Munich Agreement appeased Germany by allowing it to annex the Sudetenland. Hitler had stated that this was his last territorial demand, but the remainder of the Czech state was annexed by the Germans in 1939. It was only by the time that they reached August, after the Germans and the Soviets had signed a non-aggression pact that permitted them to divide Poland between them, that Hitler actually called the bluff of the Allies. He invaded Poland. Hitler realized that this was going to be his final act and would probably lead to war. And that's why he made this arrangement with the Russians. The Soviets invaded from the east, but of course the Germans from the west. And very, very quickly, Warsaw was surrounded and Warsaw fell. On the 3rd of September, because of the alliance between Britain and France and the Poles, Britain and France declared war on Germany. This was a peace that lasted for only 20 years. The war to end all wars had in fact not done so, but in fact just proved to be the production of a 20-year truce before the conflagration that would prove to be almost as horrific as that war on the Western Front.